The reading is from Francis Weller from an article called The Geography of Sorrow, which was recently published in Sun magazine. In this culture, we display a compulsive avoidance of difficult matters and an obsession with distraction. Because we cannot acknowledge our grief, we're forced to stay on the surface of life. Poet Kahlil Gibran said, "The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain." We experience little genuine joy in part because we avoid the depths. Before I begin, a little commercial. If you've never come up here and done this, you should. It's an amazing experience to spend, because I've talked to many people who've done it, to spend days and weeks and hours meditating on a particular idea, theme, and it both builds you up and knocks you down. And if you've never considered it, please do. And since I'm editorializing, I can't resist. Last time I spoke, somebody clapped. Since it's my talk, I get to say, please do not clap. I'm in trouble with somebody. Living with death. My life with death began when I was a teenager in the 1960s. I was a member of a wonderful Lutheran church and believed most things Christian. Therefore, death was an easy topic. We die and we go to heaven. But like many teens, I began to think deeply about the topic of death. And the more I did, the more uncertain I became as to what was what. Pretty quickly, I decided I could not believe in hell. Eternal damnation seemed impossible in a world where love existed. How could a supreme being not be aware of love? And if the supreme being was aware of love, how could it say, yeah, but I like hell too? Once hell was out of the picture, heaven's exit pretty quickly followed. Heaven was not a bad idea, but it was too unwieldy. I decided not to worry about either concept anymore. But I still needed to figure out things about death. The 60s were not just a time of love, peace, and happiness. It was also a time of death, profound, world-shaking deaths. JFK, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, all the cowboys and Indians on TV, all the soldiers on the TV shows about World War II, the horror of the body counts of American and Vietnamese soldiers in the nightly news. There were also deaths of people close to me, family members, friends, and schoolmates. Even the sense of loss of an experience when a beloved pet died and became part of the puzzle. I was thoroughly aware that death was part of life and knew that it was something I had to figure out. In 1968, I read and loved Carlos Castaneda's The Teaching of Don Juan, A Yaqui Way of Knowledge. In 1972, I was 18 years old, and Castaneda's third work in the series, Journey to Ixtlan, was published. This work changed my relationship with death. In chapter 4, the Yaqui sorcerer teacher Don Juan tells his student Carlos that, and long quote here, death is our eternal companion. It is always to our left at an arm's length. And like Carlos in the book, the idea of death being that close to me made me shudder. What was he talking about? Don Juan continues to explain. The thing to do when you're impatient is to turn to your left and ask advice from your death. Death is the only wise advisor that we have. Whenever you feel that everything is going wrong and you're about to be annihilated, turn to your death and ask if that is so. Your death will tell you that you're wrong, that nothing really matters outside its touch. Your death will tell you, I haven't touched you yet. End quote. I took Don Juan's message to heart and decided to make death my advisor. I was an avid chess player, so for my image of death, I simply borrowed the image of the wonderful chess-playing death played by Bent Ehrlich in Ingmar Bergman's film, The Seventh Seal. Anybody know that? I began living with the idea that my death was always just an arm's length away and it must be true for all of us. Decades have passed, and although Death and I do not play chess, we have a fine friendship. We can talk about anything, and sometimes we just sit and chat. I have found Death to be a loyal, honest companion and advisor. In spending time with Death, I've come to appreciate these three things. 1, Death is ever present. 2, there's no sense in worrying about an afterlife. And 3, the more time I spend living with Death, the more comfortable I become with the idea of death. Number 1, not only is death all around us, it is in us and on us. Our bodies can hardly be called our bodies when we think about the fact that we are full of microbes and bacteria. Bacteria are living and dying in numbers that we can hardly comprehend, so we won't bother trying. Let's move quickly past them and size up to Demodex folliculorum. Demodex folliculorum is one of the 2 eyelash mites that live on us, on all of us. These are not single-celled things, but actual bugs that crawl around on our faces at night doing their little buggy things. They live for a couple of weeks and they die. And as far as I know, there's not been any studies on whether they believe in an afterlife. Do we care about the deaths of these precious, cute little critters? No, we don't. So let's continue moving up the chain of life form complexity to mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are sophisticated and highly successful. The day-flying tiger mosquito is actually quite pretty. If you don't think they're important, take a moment and try to imagine the catastrophic consequence to the food web if we killed them all. But even admirers are not likely to spare mosquitoes that have the audacity to attack and bite. As Hamlet said when he had his 2 friends killed, they are not near my conscience. It is a rare person who is touched by the death of a mosquito. As we continue along this line of thought, we move through life forms that we may start to care about. Fish, butterflies, oak trees, mice, rabbits, deer, bears, dogs, chimpanzees. What they all have in common is they die. What is not in common is the degree in which we hold dear these things. We're rarely aware of critters like bacteria and microscopic lice. We may become more aware of mosquitoes, but have little reason to be in relationship with one, and may even like the idea of the death of a particular mosquito. With pets like dogs and cats, we often find that we miss them dearly once they die. The idea here is that death, which is everywhere in all moments, may not be the problem, but rather it is our reaction to it that we need to consider. Let me put it this way. I'm not afraid that creatures will die. I am afraid the creatures I love will die. Because the death of things I love is inevitable, it makes sense for me to grow comfortable with that idea. My death therefore advises me to be ever increasing my capacity for loving relationships with the world and life. It would be silly to put myself in a position where death could empty my life of loving relationships. A couple of years ago, one of my very best lifelong friends died. Because we did so many things together over 50 years, I find reminders of him everywhere and find him in my thoughts almost daily. But I've been advised by my death to remember that the time I spent with him has now been freed up, and that this freed up time can be used to enjoy relationships with other people and the world. Point 2. I've done my share of thinking about life after death and no longer see a need to worry about it. For one thing, it is hard to think about life after death without the eternity word working its way forward. And for me, again, I can't resist, that's a dead end. I crossed that out. That's terrible. It's just... Maybe some people can wrap their head around that idea, but I can't. Afterlife, or if you will, after death, comes in these basic flavors: heaven, reincarnation, dissolving back into the great primal matter, and hell. The supporting arguments for these concepts have not proven to be universally convincing, so I'm content to sit on the sidelines and let others figure this matter out. A major question with after death is, do we bring our consciousness with us? Any concept of heaven must consider the issue. Usually we dismiss the idea of plant heaven because we do not think of plants as having consciousness or souls. When we do think of plants in heaven, we're usually meditating on whether or not there'll be fresh Jersey tomatoes there for us. With animals, it can be even more difficult to determine consciousness and soul. Is there a heaven for cows? Are there cows in human heaven? Visions of heaven are personalized and hard to agree on. 40 years ago, I decided that if I needed an image of heaven, I would use the one that appeared on an album cover of bluesman John Lee Hooker. On the cover, the masses are swarming into what might be the gates of heaven. The album's title is written on the gates: Free Beer and Chicken. I love the idea of reincarnation, but do not need to die to experience it. I think of one of the key ideas of it on a regular basis: cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect. Whether or not I can always see it, I know that I am the result of my actions. Each moment, I am being reborn into lives that I have created for myself. I also love the idea of dissolving back into the cosmic matter, although the concepts of eternity and infinity sometimes get in my way. Therefore, if I'm going to think of death in this way, I like to think of returning to the earth. I think most ancient people had a big advantage on us in that they really returned people to the earth in ways that did not retard or prevent their return to the food chain and to the ways of Mother Earth. It's healthy for me to recognize that I am part of a greater whole. It is important for me to recognize that my actions affect the world around me. After a life of feeding, I find the idea of being fed on attractive. Despite what I've said earlier, I cannot leave out the after-death option of hell. Fortunately, Far Side theologian cartoonist Gary Larson has figured hell out. A few of my favorite Larson Hell cartoons are the TV weatherman in hell who is saying, well, doggone it, but I'm afraid that cold front I told you about yesterday is just barely going to miss us. And another one divides into two sides. And on the one side, harps are being given out in heaven. And on the other side, accordions. And the last one, it looks like there's a work break in hell. And there's someone standing there with a cup of coffee and says, oh man, the coffee's cold. They've thought of everything. We create hells all the time as we go through life. To outside observers, most of the ones we create look as silly as Larson cartoons. My death advises me that I do not need a threat of an after-death hell to remind me to live consciously. Point 3. The more time I spend with death, the more comfortable I become with it. And I would rather be comfortable than uncomfortable. A couple of years ago, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer. It was an aggressive type, and the doctors convinced me that I should have the offending body part removed. During the surgery, it was discovered that the cancer had escaped to what is known as the margins. Some months later, testing indicated that I still had cancerous cells, which did not surprise me because it's tough to scrape away every cell from a membrane. The next step was radiation, which I went through 2 summers ago. I find that I am fine with my cancer thing. When people ask me about it, I think sometimes they're surprised when I respond with something like, I don't care about it because it doesn't affect my daily life. They may comment something like, I know you're going to beat it. Now, please forgive me because These are loving friends voicing loving concerns, and I don't mean to create offense. But my likely response to that comment is laughter. I laugh as I think of images of beating death. In one scenario, I think of death as a baseball team that I've just eliminated from the playoffs and hear it say, "Yeah, but wait till next year." In my mind, there is nothing to beat. I was told by someone that I could beat cancer because I was a fighter. I like to think of myself as a lover, not a fighter. Fighting my death is not as good as living my life. Sometimes when someone asks about my cancer, I say the cancer is going to punch my ticket. If it doesn't, that's not a big deal because either way, something is going to punch my ticket. I feel fortunate that I've been given a gift that reminds me of the importance of living in the moment and the stupidity of holding grudges. I'm not going to recommend becoming ill so that you can contemplate death. Disease is usually expensive and almost always an inconvenience to those around you. Instead of contacting a fatal disease, here are 2 alternative rub elbows with death exercises that have helped me maintain a sense of balance. The first is that I make a mental list, because these lists aren't worth writing down, of things that I won't be around for if I die. Some things I wish I could stick for are such as a great-grandchild, a trip to Australia, and seeing the Phillies win another World Series. Some things I will be fine missing include the next pandemic, the coming extinction of the Kirtland's warbler, Donald Trump's 5th term as President of the United States, and the Phillies never playing in another World Series. I figure there's no end of things to see and experience, so I want to be aware of what is here and now. The second exercise is to think about what your last thoughts might be. Here are 2 examples that might refresh the way you think. The first is from Woody Allen. He says, "I'm very proud of my gold watch. My grandfather, on his deathbed, sold it to me." Here's a thought from Henriette Mandel. "If I am ever stuck on a respirator or on a life support system, I definitely want to be unplugged, but not until I get down to a size 8. You might imagine that an outcome of living with death and growing comfortable in its presence is that one can become grief-free. I've not found this true in my own life. I experience grief in a surprising, powerful, and profound manner. I believe that grieving is a fundamental part of our human nature. Neither of my parents died suddenly, and I had months to prepare myself for their deaths. However, when my father died, I was shocked by how much it hurt. It was the same when my mother died. I had the feeling that something had been carved out of me. That makes sense because something had been carved out of me, a living in relationship with someone I loved. When my mother died, I wept, it's easy to do, with racking sobs. I found it almost impossible to speak because I was so choked up. But I'd been living with death for years and knew there was nothing unique in what I was experiencing. I was mourning for a loss. And yes, things would never be the same. But when can we ever close our eyes at night at the end of a day and not be able to say, things will never be the same because of what happened on this day? I feel sad when I read in the newspaper about a mother who's lost a child and says her life will never be the same, when I have reason to believe that what might be meant is that she thinks her life can never be well again. Can you imagine someone who loves you wishing you were miserable because they died? We lived so happily for all those years, and now that I'm dead, I want you to spend the rest of your life in misery. It just doesn't ring true. I think if we choose to live with death, we are choosing to have control in our lives. I do not want to feel victimized by my death or the death of someone I love. I do not want a fear of death to paralyze me and prevent me from taking actions that will better the lives of those around me. My life is the blink of an eye, and no one will remember me. Only my actions live on.